second arena was were comments that were particular to our proposed way of implementing high-speed rail. And there, our view was that the inputs that we received from this body, from your legislative peer review group, from the Legislative Analyst's Office, from others, that many of those comments had merit. And I just want to hit several of those areas and tell you how we addressed them. The first one was that, as most people know, the original plan was to build a 130-mile track in the Central Valley from approximately Madera to approximately Bakersfield. And that was it. There were no additional investments in other parts of the state, in the urban areas. There was only an attenuated effort to say how that track could ultimately be used as a backstop and so forth. And there was a sense that if we got more funds in the future that we would build perhaps to the north, perhaps to the south. That question was very much open. That was, of course, criticized for not having sufficient utility. And I really want to focus on this issue of risk. If there was no further funding coming forth immediately or for some period of time, what do we have for that? And Mr. Chairman, Chairman Lowenthal, and also your colleague, Senator DeSaulnier, in this room on December 5th, we went through the logical syllogism about the utility of that investment opportunity. And we listened very carefully to that, and frankly, the points that were made here were correct. So we looked at that. A number of you and your colleagues have raised the issue about, given the disproportionate population in our urban areas and the very strong need for transit investments there, whether or not high-speed rail shouldn't be making advanced investments in the urban areas, which we refer to as the bookends, the ends of the system as they come into the urban areas. And clearly that was another area as well that needed to be addressed. And finally, there was the notion that, you know, we're just not going to see any trains or train service for a long time with this draft plan we had in November, and so how can we address that? My colleagues and I, and we're also here with staff and other consulting resources from the High-Speed Rail Authority. I want to tell you that this board, I believe, worked very hard, and also I'm pleased, since this is a plural body, that we work very well together to really address these issues. What you have before you today, very quickly, I think builds off of that other plan. I want to indicate it is not a radical departure, but what it does in many ways is find ways to accelerate investments that would have been made later, to do other things that really build off of the framework that was there. And so there are really four major aspects of this that I will touch on quickly, Mr. Chairman. First, we directly address this question of the independent utility of the initial investment. For reasons we can go into, we still believe it's both prudent and necessary to commence construction in the Central Valley. However, as a result of our work with the Governor's Office and the Department of Finance, we now are in a position where we have been allowed to request access to cap-and-trade dollars if we need them, which is allowing us to plan not for an initial construction segment, and we've sort of dispensed with that term, but to look at an initial operating segment that would be built in 3 steps, but that would connect the Central Valley to the Los Angeles Basin. So it's very significant. We've gotten rid of this sort of beauty contest notion that someday in the future we'll decide if we're going north and south. And we've said that the most important thing for us to do is to build an operating segment that goes from the Central Valley, our fastest growing portion of the state, to the Los Angeles area, which is the most populous part of our state. And I want to indicate this will be a usable segment that will be fully electrified with positive train control that can operate, according to all of our ridership projections that we've looked at, that can operate on a going forward operating profitable basis. And this can be constructed and in operation in 10 years. Now, what we're trying to do in the meantime is, as we build this from the Central Valley to the south, we don't want to wait around with this track just waiting for trains to show up. And so, working with our colleagues at Caltrans, we now are talking about taking the very popular San Joaquin's service, which goes from both Sacramento and Oakland down to Bakersfield, and shifting the southern portion of that onto the newly constructed high-speed rail line. And, again, as we're waiting for the full high-speed rail trains to come. A number of people are going to appear before you and express concerns about the loss of service in the southern San Joaquin Valley on that. I just want to say at this moment we believe we should find a way to preserve some existing Amtrak service there. It's very important to those communities. But we would be upgrading, with the help of Caltrans, the northern portion of that network, and right now that's about a 5 to 6 hour train ride down the valley to Senator Fuller's district, and we believe that we could cut at least an hour, hour and 15 minutes off that time. We would be separating passenger from freight to a greater extent on the southern portion of that line, which improves freight efficiency, freight movement and safety. It's very important to the Central Valley for movement of agricultural products out of the valley towards the ports. And so this would have, we believe, significant utility, both in terms of safety, speed, and potentially capacity operation on what is today the 5th most traveled Amtrak corridor in the nation. And I have not forgotten, Senator Lowenthal, what the 2nd most traveled is, which is your Lausanne corridor. So we're going to get to that. In addition, and I'll be very quick here, sir, we are also talking at the same time about making significant investments in the early years, early advanced investments in the bookends. We have now executed a memorandum of understanding with Southern California regional transit operators that commits us to help them provide $1 billion over the next 8 years for improvements in their systems there, over and above the connectivity money that is part of Prop 1A, which is also part of the administration's budget request for you this year. So that's a significant amount of investment in early years in Southern California in critical projects like their interregional connector, Lausanne upgrades, and so forth. And in the north, a separate MOU has been executed with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission focused on the electrification of the Caltrain system. Now, because we're using the blended approach, relying on that, this means we can make an early investment in a corridor where people have been looking for that kind of electrification for decades, and we will be coming up those tracks in the future as we get into that area. Finally, I would point out that between November and now, if you look back at our November draft plan, Mr. Rossi and I, Mr. Hartnett, I think we paid somewhat of a price for our candor, but our view was we needed to tell people what this system would truly cost. You as decision makers would decide what to do with that information. But we came out and said, look, over the next 20 years, using fully inflated dollars, this system would cost up to $98 billion. But I would like to point out that at that time, we said, if we were able to rely on the blended approach, it would cost $78 billion. We have now determined, since November, that we have confidence that we can rely on the blended approach, the use of shared tracks in the peninsula area in particular. And so that means that we can accomplish the Prop 1A objectives starting at the $78 billion. We have said, in addition to that, when you look at some other changes we've made, which we can go through, when you look at actual inflationary changes between then and now, that number actually comes down to $68 billion. So I do understand, Mr. Chairman, that a lot of people in the media have said these numbers have bounced all around, but in fact there's a very simple, logical progression from the numbers we provided in November to the numbers we provide today. With that, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and the committee for allowing me to make this presentation, and we will be ready to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. What I'd like to do is ask Senator Lowenthal to begin with questions, and then Senator Fuller, and then I. And we're going to go to the Pledge Council, but I want to make sure that Senator Lowenthal, particularly since he has to go to committee, has the opportunity to check in. I feel sure Senator Fuller and I will have plenty to talk about after he has to depart. So, Senator, the floor is yours.
First of all, I want to thank the authority for listening and modifying their business plan, especially after the hearings that we have, and I think it is definitely a step in the right direction. But I still have some questions and issues that I need to understand. One is that initially you talked about how you believe this new business plan can meet the legal requirements of Prop 1A. Can you provide us with a legal opinions that it does meet that? We have never, I don't know, I have not seen. Does it, do you have legal opinion, and have you provided that to anyone, that it does meet the legal obligations?
Senator, what I'm hearing your question, I guess, is two things. I was expressing one thing, but you're raising another key point. When I said we meet the legal requirements of Prop 1A, what I meant to say is that our engineers tell us that we can, even using the shared tracks, given the fact that trains do not go 200 miles an hour in the urban areas anyway, that we can achieve the speed, the time, and the lack of operating subsidy. That we are convinced of that, which was the first order thing we need to do. Your question, I believe, Senator, goes to an issue that has been out there, which is whether or not we can get an opinion from the Attorney General to give us confidence that the blended approach that's been proposed is in fact consistent with Prop 1A. What I will tell you on that is we do not have that opinion in hand today. If we did, we would have provided it. But I will also tell you that we have met recently with the Attorney General's office to tell them that this is a very important matter. We know it's important for you in the legislature, and we know it's important for members of the community because, and we told, and it's important for us because we told the Attorney General's office we're about to issue a plan based on this, and you know, we would like to do something we believe is compliant.
Excuse the interruption, Senator. Excuse me, Mr. Richards. Senator Lowenthal, important to remind everybody there wasn't a plan formally approved by your board until April the 12th. So the question, you know, by virtue of the fact that the plan has been a work in progress, it seemed to me required that we know what the final product was as approved by the board on April the 12th. Just so you know, Senator, and all of our colleagues and members of the public, earlier today, I believe, Senator DeSaulnier and I sent off a letter, Senator DeSaulnier in his role as chair of the Policy Committee on Transportation, and I in my role as chair of the Budget Subcommittee, to our Legislative Counsel, as distinguished from the Attorney General, asking the very simple question, without many bells and whistles. We have a plan now. It was voted on and approved by the High Speed Rail Authority. Is this plan Prop 1A legally compliant? Right. Not clear how long it will take the Legislative Council to get back to us, although we raised this issue with them some weeks ago. So, you know, I'm looking forward to the opportunity for the AG to weigh in if and when the AG's office feels that they can and want to do that. But, of course, our legal counsel is the Legislative Council that represents the California State Legislature. We've asked for their opinion as well. And Mr. Richard, it's a critical point because while there is obviously a great deal of debate, and we're going to have a lot of conversation between now and D-Day, whenever that is, The starting point is, can we do this legally? Because if the answer to that question is no, we can save ourselves a lot of time and conversation. So
Yes, sir.
back to you and Mr. Lowenthal.
Yes,
Yep.
and let me just say, Senator, Mr. Chairman, I think that that's very helpful that you did that. We would like clarity on this issue as well. And just to complete my answer to Senator Lowenthal, we have encouraged the AG, not that they need, that they will necessarily be responsive, but we have encouraged the AG to please provide this information as quickly as possible, precisely for the reason that the chairman mentioned, that it is critical to this.
And for myself also, you can say that it's very important that this committee understand just really where the legal issues are, if they are any issues or not any issues. And so I'm very pleased that we will have hopefully 2 legal opinions, one from the AG and one from the Ledge Council. I think that is critically important for our understanding with the changes that have been made and where, as Senator Simitian indicated, this has just been approved by your board on the 12th of April. And so we need to understand with this, are we compliant with Prop 1A?
We agree, Senator.
Okay, that's the first. Second one is I understand, I am very concerned, I have been, that in my role, that we are acting in a fiscally responsible way. And so what you've done is you've laid out a scenario in which we will be funding using, I think, approximately $2.7 billion of state funds now, of the state bond of the $9 billion, so about a third of it, for the Central Valley from wherever you begin at, wherever that is, at Modesto, wherever that is, or on the other, north of Fresno, to Bakersfield, and the federal money also. So about $6 billion will be spent in the Central Valley of the $13 billion when we count together all the federal money. Then when you take out the money that is used for other expenses, the money that will be will be used for the blended approach in the San Francisco to San Jose, and what you pointed out in the blended approach in Southern California, that reduces the amount of money left, as I understand it, left for that other part that you critically announced, which we don't have, which we're not moving forward right now, which would be the next step. There's about a little over, somewhere between $4 and $5 billion for the Bakersfield to LA. And as I understand, I haven't gone through, of an approach that will cost approximately, to complete that, somewhere $15 to $17 billion to do that. So let's say, so we're short somewhere between $12 to $13 billion, even with the money. You then said, well, where do we get this money? To have it connected, to have a rail system, an integrated rail system, we're short now even to have that $13 billion. We're going to use cap and trade. We're not going to use federal money, as you understand today. We're not quite sure. That's very iffy. And today the Senate Appropriations Committee eliminated all money for high-speed rail. This is the Senate, and then we know the House also has done it.
That would be the U.S. Senate, just to be clear.
The U.S. Senate. And I just say the U.S. Senate, we disallowed all of the President's 2013 requests for high-speed rail, the $4 billion he was requesting. And the money will go for either Amtrak or some passenger rail grant program. So there is not going to be any money. It can't even go to a conference committee. There will not, because the House has not. There will be no money, at least in the 2013, for high-speed rail. So that makes that questionable. So the only way, as I understand that, foreseeable, because we haven't heard anything about private sector money and it's kind of left open, is to use cap and trade. So the question is, to me, is you're talking about $12 to $13 billion of cap and trade in the next 5 to 10 years that we're going to use for high-speed rail. Is that what you are telling us? Because you came and said we can use high-speed rail for that. We can use cap and trade. Are you assuming now, and I just need to understand, that we are going to get $12 to $13 billion of cap and trade to use for high-speed rail to connect the first section?
Well, First of all, let me just say, I imagine this committee will also decide that it's not going to appropriate us federal money today. So, I mean, we understand that. Senator, my answer to you is that we have said that we view cap and trade as a backstop. So let me tell you how we would proceed on this prior.
And then you'll tell us what the front stop is also?
That's what I'm going to do right now.
Okay.
So, you know, next week I'm hopeful that we will be moving to conclude something with a new CFO. We'll get to this, but we've got a few positions we need to fill at the High-Speed Rail Authority. You know, it turns out that in Japan, 32% of the operating revenues for the Japan East Railroad, which is privately operated now, having been built on the governmental infrastructure, comes from real estate development around their stations. We have zero in our plan right now because the High-Speed Rail Authority, up until this point, has not really tried to plumb that. My old organization at BART had significant revenues that came from the lease of its right-of-way for fiber optic. We're talking about 500 miles of right-of-way from Los Angeles to San Francisco. That's prime territory for this. We're going through areas in the Antelope Valley and the southern San Joaquin Valley where there's active solar and wind energy development. We're going to have an alignment right-of-way. So what I would say to you is this. Number one, we are going to continue to aggressively pursue federal money. In our plan in November, which we repeated, which we believe was prudent, we said that we did not foresee any federal support for the next 3 budget years. And we said that because we thought we needed to get past the reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Act, maybe some other events that would occur along the way as well. I will point out that people like Chairman Mica of the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee were always big advocates of high-speed rail. And I don't mean to be glib about this, but my hope is that as we move past the political season, we might be able to find some bipartisan support again. I would also point out that federal money doesn't just come in the form of direct federal grants. There are Railroad Improvement Fund loans that we could qualify for. There are Tiger grants. There are a number of different federal loan and grant programs outside of direct federal appropriations. Still, I don't know what we'll get there, but we will push aggressively to do that. We may not get anything, but we're talking about over the next 10 years.
You hope to have this section between Bakersfield, which creates the integrated system, done in the next 10 years.
That's correct.
So you're talking about we're going to receive as much money from either federal grants or, as you pointed out, other kinds of investments, or maybe land that's around there that can be used at the right-of-way, or cap and trade.
Or cap and trade if we need it. So
that's $13 billion we're talking about. And don't you think that's kind of a high-risk strategy for us to go forward and think that we're going to somehow, it's all predicated to build this integrated system that first, because it can't run. You have a stretch of 130 miles in the Central Valley, and then you have down in L.A., but you have to take a bus between the Bakersfield and L.A. You don't have a system. You need that additional $13 billion to build that system.
We do.
Is that not a high-risk strategy for us?
No, I don't believe so, and let me tell you why.
Okay.
First of all, I'm going to urge that we look at this in terms of balancing risk. I think that the main thing that we have learned from the dialogue in this committee is that it's essential to look at the independent utility of every step that we take. And that we don't, I'm going to tell you that I believe that it is normal and customary in the world of transit funding to not know where all these pieces are coming from. Senator, in your part of the world, they just adopted a regional transportation plan, $524 billion for all of the Southern California rail agencies over the same 20-year period we're looking at. And some of that is Prop 1B, infrastructure bond money, some of it is other sources, but I don't believe they know where all that's coming from. But the key here, and I think this committee has emphasized this, and we've taken this to heart, in 2 things. One, we will not commence any segment unless we have the dollars in hand for that segment. We can have funding plans right now, but we won't actually go forward and ask you for any segment until we have the dollars.
Excuse me, Mr. Ridge.
Yes,
Senator
Mr.
Lowenthal,
Chairman.
can I take a piece of your question? Please?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I appreciate your letting me jump into the mix. And it must be something about the chair that Senator Lowenthal is sitting in, because when we were here in December 5th, I think that's where I sat, and the exchange that we had, which I found very helpful, and I think you've tried to respond to, went like this. I said, so Mr. Richard, as I understand it, you're talking about spending all of our federal money, $3.5 billion, plus more than a quarter of our state money, $2.7 billion, for a total of $6.2 billion to produce 130 miles of conventional rail in a low ridership area that doesn't have positive train control, that doesn't have electrification, and that doesn't have high-speed rail rolling stock, and with no guarantees of further federal funding, private investment, and no plans to come back and ask the taxpayers for another bond measure. And you were forthcoming enough to say, yeah, to start. And the point that I made at the time, which is consistent with the point that Senator Lowenthal is making, is that's an awful lot of money for a high-speed rail system that isn't high-speed rail in a low ridership area. And I think that's what your plan is trying to respond to. But my question is, as I read through the plan, isn't that still what you're planning to build initially, and then come back later to do the electrification, the positive train control, and the high-speed rail rolling stock? So while the phrase initial construction segment is no longer there, what I see is that the first $6.2 billion expended in what you're calling the initial operating segment is still what we discussed in December.
With two significant differences, Mr. Chairman. First of all, prior to our conversation with the Finance Department about our ability to make requests of you of cap-and-trade dollars, it had been our plan before we knew that we would have access to those funds. We felt that we were very close to being able to come back and say, actually, the first segment will be an electrified, positive train-controlled segment. Trains can be tested on that. Some people may choose to run trains on that. We've actually, as we were in conversations, we actually have letters from manufacturers telling us that they'd be very interested in demonstrating their trains on that and so forth. So that's the first thing, is we were not going to come back to you with just that same thing. We wanted to have two aspects of it. One, we wanted it to really be absolutely ready and not just almost ready for high-speed rail operation. And the second was we wanted it connected and tied in to an existing network so that it made sense. So those two elements really are different.
But Mr. Richard, again, and I'm going to be, and I hope you'll understand and bear with me, I'm going to want to get hard answers to hard questions, because that's the process we're in.
Yes.
And so my question again is, the first $6.2 billion gets spent the way I just described it, does it or does it not, to create a 130-mile stretch of conventional rail in a low ridership area using 3.5 all of federal funding and 2.7 more than a quarter of state funding. And before you go on to do whatever the next thing is, that's the starting point in your plan for the Valley, yes?
With the exception of, I would probably disagree with the characterization of it as a low ridership area, perhaps in relative terms, but not in absolute, then I would say yes.
Let me interrupt for just a moment. In the bookends, as you described them, there are 28 million riders, as I understand it. In the Central Valley, there were 1 million. Is that a fair characterization?
Actually, Senator, I would say it's not, because there are 28 million riders on intra-regional transit systems, as opposed to the 1 million riders who are intercity riders. And that is what high-speed rail is intended to address.
So what I understood you to just say is, yes, there are 28 million riders there and there are 1 million riders here. You just disagree about whether or not those are apples-to-apples comparisons, because we have intra versus intercity trips. But in terms of the number of folks out there who are climbing on trains, these are numbers we've had in previous conversations. And I'm going to be like this, sir, until the very last hearing when the very last gavel goes down, because if we're going to get to yes, we got to get to yes based on a common understanding of hard facts on the ground.
Senator, you're not going to have a problem from us asking hard questions.
Thank you. So Then my question, and hang in with me, Senator, because I know we have to let you go, is, so that's where the first $6.2 million goes. And it raises a question that Senator Lowenthal has raised in the past, which is, I think many of us feel like we understand that if you're going to get $3.5 billion from the federal government, that you have to use it for what the federal government authorizes it for. And we understand that if you're going to get a matching requirement or obligation as part of the deal, that you have to put money up to match. But the part that is perplexing is we have to use our money where the feds tell us, even though it's our money. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Senator Lowenthal, if he doesn't mind me leading him back to his own issue.
That's right. And the question is, just to follow up on that, and that's has there been any formal attempt to delink this money? Has the authority formally addressed the government to say, to say that while we'll spend the money at the same time, we would prefer to spend the money, our money, as you're building your track out there, to begin to add our almost $3 billion to the $4 billion that makes this connection from Bakersfield to L.A., to spend it in the way that the authority deems as the most important. That's the first question, is, has there been any attempt to do that? And the second one is, following up on what Senator Simitian has said, and because this is what, there still is, to make this operational, this system to become a integrated rail system, you have to fix Bakersfield to L.A. It just has to be done. We don't have the money. You're saying, well, there may be other. When you, even though as you pointed out, the business plan has changed somewhat, it's still based upon the earlier one, in which, as Senator Simitian has correctly pointed out, almost half of our money is being spent in the Central Valley. Your own peer reviews committee said that's a high-risk strategy. How do you respond to that? That the money should not be spent in the Central Valley. Your own peer review, before we even get to the LAO report.
First of all, Senator, just working backwards, I think it's probably more accurate to say it's your legislative peer review group. I mean, it is, their responsibility is to you.
It is based upon legislation. That is
right,
true.
But I mean, I think if Mr. Kempton and those members were sitting here, they would say that they're
absolutely. I accept that.
Their responsibility is to you, not to us.
And thank heaven that the legislature did put in that there would be a peer review group.
Senator Lowenthal, thank heaven that many of these questions have been asked over the years. I mean, you've heard me say this publicly. I'll say it again today. This is a better plan and a better process.
I know that, and I agree with you.
Because of what people in this committee and your other committees have done.
Right.
Let me go back to your question. The direct answer to your question about whether or not any application has been made to change excuse me, the Central Valley route.
Just the delink, not change it.
To delink the federal.
Senator said, the federal government wants to spend their money, God bless them, let them spend it. Why do we have to let them dictate, if we commit to spending a comparable amount of money, why does it have to be spent in exactly the same place? Okay, first of all, the direct answer to your question, and I want to do this as much as possible, is, as far as I know, the answer is no. If I may, I would like to explain why, as far as I know, that nobody has asked that that be delinked. When I came onto this board, like many people, I was bewildered, perplexed by what the High-Speed Rail Authority was doing. And let's not forget, it wasn't Bakersfield to Merced. I believe it was Borden to Corcoran. So we were connecting Elsie the cow with the prison population at the correctional facility. And it didn't make any sense to me as a lay person. And I had, coming from the BART background, had a very keen understanding of the importance of regional transit systems and the number of people that they carry and what it means. I have come to believe that the decisions that were made now to look at Merced to Bakersfield, and we will continue to think of that as part of an initial operating segment, but Mr. Chairman, I understand why others would characterize it in a different way, I believe is the correct one now, and I say that as a resident of Northern California. And I understand the importance of the gap between Bakersfield and Palmdale. First of all, whether this is relevant or not, the state
prior to any of the three of us being here, made application to the federal government, and as you know, Senator Lowenthal, they probably did not need to do this at the time, but in order to make the application more palatable, the state committed that it would use some of its bond money to match the federal money. It was not required, but California did it. I don't know what the decisional process was. I think there's a feeling that that helped California win some of those federal dollars. So be it. We are told by our friends at...
That did not go through the legislature.
And it did, and
That
also...
application.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I understand. But these are the cards that we were dealt when we got here. So the issue becomes, can we move this forward?
Excuse me, Mr. Richard, I do want to let you finish the question, but I want to underscore Senator Lowenthal's point. The authority took it on itself to make a commitment of the expenditure of state funds which had not yet been appropriated by the legislature in a budgetary process. So if you see people saying, tell us again what's going on this particular stretch,
that's right.
The concern is that this was a judgment that the authority apparently made without legislative engagement.
And Mr. Chairman, if you'll permit me the liberty of pronoun control as we go through this process, there will be times I will say they as opposed to we, and with a very deliberate reason for that, because the three of us were not part of those decisions. And I understand that they may need to be questioned. I will explain as best I can things that happened beforehand, but I don't know all the motivations that were there. But Senator Lowenthal, when I came in and we started looking at this, and I can't speak for my colleagues, but I mean, I certainly looked at it, because you and others were raising this question of, have we handcuffed ourselves to something that doesn't make any sense? And I came away with two conclusions to that. One is that the answer is probably yes. Whether it should have happened that way or not, it did not appear to me that there was a legal way to back out either our dollars or to get the federal government to redirect their dollars. And we can go into depth on that.
There's never been a formal request to the federal government to say we'll spend our dollars where we think our dollars should be spent.
But there have been informal conversations, and I think one of the realities is that we have, of course, as you know, benefited from the redirection of money from other states, and when you look at what happened in those other states, those states made requests that were very much like that, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Florida, and they were told no.
Well, Mr. Richard, excuse the interruption. My recollection is that those states essentially wanted to redirect their funds towards commuter rail rather than high-speed rail. Am I remembering that incorrectly?
I mean, I was not around, but that's my understanding also, and some of their other systems.
Well, that's not what Senator Lowenthal is asking.
No,
I'm saying, do we have any control over how we spend our money?
Okay, so let's talk about Bakersfield to Palmdale for a moment.
That's where you want to spend. I'm just saying, before we...
Do we have any control?
You're asking us to make a decision about the allocation of money when, in fact, someone, without asking the legislature, allocated that and took away our responsibility, our authority to do that. They made that decision for us. And now we either go along with it or don't go along with it. And I think that's a difficult place to be.
Or press for the request to be made to delink the funds.
That's right, to delink it. And nothing has happened. We're just assuming that that's what's... I'm not even saying the bakers. I'm just saying that given the response, I would give it back to the high-speed rail authority where to spend the money based upon what's in the best needs of California, not what's in the best interest of the federal government.
Okay. So the best answer I can give you is that, number one, I personally believe that you are faced with a binary decision to decide to accept the federal funds, which right now contractually means a match from the state, or not. I don't believe that there is any practical...
Mr. Richard, I'm sorry, sir, but I'm going to keep you precise in your language as we go through this process.
Yes, I appreciate that.
Senator Lowenthal isn't suggesting otherwise. Senator Lowenthal and every member of this committee has said at every point we understand we have to do a match. The question isn't whether we have to do a match. The question isn't stepping away from the match we've committed to. The question is the use of the matching funds and whether or not they should be delinked from the expenditure of federal funds in the Central Valley.
Okay, and I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I thought that I was trying to address that. There are, as I understand it, a number of reasons why we cannot do that. What I have been told directly by the Chief Counsel of the Federal Railroad Administration is that they view the application that California made, whether it should have been made that way or not, as part of a competitive process, and that if California did not, if California wanted to do something else with the federal money, then that would require them to essentially recompete those dollars. And I think that is a practical problem. If we do not use the federal dollars, we have nothing against which to match the state bond dollars. If we don't use the state bond dollars contractually, we will not be able to access those federal dollars without going back through a new competitive process, is what we have been told. I believe that's responsive to your question.
And Senator Lowenthal, I don't believe it is responsive to your question, because I believe your question wasn't about whether or not we would use the $3.5 billion in federal funding for the purpose it was granted for. You've indicated you understand we have to do that. Your question is, do we have to take the $2.7 billion match and use it in concert with that particular 3.5 federal expenditure in the Central Valley, or might that 2.7 be used to move high-speed rail forward in some other way, in some other place that had, in the judgment of the state of California, greater utility, given the fact that we have no guarantees long-term about additional funding?
If I understand your question, and I want to make sure that I understand it precisely, it seems to me the import of the question is that the way we would do that would be to essentially say, we are not going to accept the federal dollars. We're going to save our bond money against some future pot of money that we can match it against to build something else.
Again,
because I don't see any other way.
That's not what I was asking, and I agree with you. That may be one way. I am saying that, and I keep getting back, if we were in this, we did not, you did not, it's not we, it's now they. Decisions were made to, even though statutorily we were not required to do a match, to use state money, without checking with the legislature, but to use state money in a particular way which was not required by the ARA funding, but it was a part of our application. Has or have you done anything formally, or have you requested that the legislature or the governor or your authority formally request the federal government to say, we want to take your money, if you want to spend your money there, that's fine, but we need to match that, if we're required to do a match, in ways in which we think are in the best interest of the state of California. And I have not seen anything in writing that indicated, besides, well, we've informally had these discussions or this, that we've done that, and I am not sure that we can't do that.
Well, Senator, you and the chairman have asked this question a couple times, and I seem to have missed the ball as it's coming by. So I don't want to get to strike three here. But I guess, I mean, my sense is, let me just say what my sense is, because I really do want to be as precise as I can. I do not see any way legally, and I'd like to talk about why I don't think it's a good idea, but I do not see any way legally to change what is currently before us, which is a federal offer of the $3.3 billion predicated on a state match of $2.7 billion to build that facility in that part of the Central Valley. I don't see any way legally to modify that. And that is why I'm not aware of any formal request to do so. Any effort to delink those dollars essentially makes both of them retreat back to their original treasuries. If we don't use the 2.7 as the match, as California, whether it should have or not, made in its bid application, we lose the federal dollars. If we lose the federal dollars, we have nothing at present against which to match any portion of the bond money. That's my understanding.
I'm going to ask the Legislative Analyst's Office to look at this specific issue and to look at the documents. And I want to be very clear, Mr. Richard, I know you're multitasking. Mr. Richard, I'm going to ask the Legislative Analyst's Office
Yes, I heard that, sir.
to look at the documents along with the Legislative Council and look at this issue of linkage, because the question is still out there. I mean, putting aside the legalities for a moment, it seems to me that the logical question to ask at this point is, you've told us you want to build something that you now call an initial operating segment. There are places to spend the money besides this initial expenditure of $2.7 billion that would be inside your initial operating segment that would have value added for the state, rather than as part of the 130 miles of non-high-speed rail track in the low ridership area. So the question is that something that can be done?
Okay.
And I'm going to ask
and which our peer review, maybe not your peer review any longer, it's what the legislature indicated, that if we did have more options, that it would be the peer review, a lower risk strategy to use our money someplace else. That's what they said.
Well, I think the question is the federal grant for a specific project description, or is it for the Central Valley more broadly? If the answer is it's for the specific project, then Senator Lowenthal and others may be disappointed that the High-Speed Rail Authority went ahead and made that commitment of funds, which funds they did not yet have allocated to them. If it's for the Central Valley more broadly, or that potential is there, then we're going to keep asking the question. And I'll just say candidly, this is part of a larger concern I have, which is that the authority, and I keep using that rather than the pronoun because that allows me to avoid the you-they problem, and also to make clear that it's not personal as we go back and forth in the conversation. The authority has a history of making certain decisions or judgments or delivering certain products on a certain schedule and then saying, now you all are stuck with our timeline and our decisions. And if we're going to be successful going forward, that has to stop. So we'll work with the folks at the LAO and the Legislative Council to ask those questions.
Right. And Mr. Chairman, may I suggest that as they're looking at the documents, there was a letter, I don't have the date, from the Undersecretary of Transportation that was sent to the authority, and it was basically prompted by some of the statements that were made in some of the legislative peer review documents that addressed this question with specificity.
Right.
And if I might, and I know that it's going to be a long afternoon, but I'd just like to take one moment and talk about why I think, irrespective of the issues you just raised, it is the right place to start anyway. And I would love to see us close the Bakersfield to Palmdale gap. In fact, we are, as part of our business plan, absolutely committed to doing that. But I do want to point out that, based on our estimates right now, that is an $11 billion facility. We do not have sufficient resources to get that built at the time that the authority made application to it. And even today, it would require not only federal funds, but it would require all these things we talked about before.
No,
so,
it would require the federal, state, and what's left over.
And right, but we would, if
we would have the gap closed, if that's what the authority felt was the most important.
I'm sorry, Senator, I guess I'm missing the math there.
You said it's $11 billion.
That's correct. So we would need, and our bonds must be matched, according to the law, as you know, by at least 50%. So we cannot just expend all of our bond money.
Okay.
We would need to have at least $5.5 billion of some non-bond source. That's
nice
where
to have the federal government respond to our needs rather than us responding to the federal government's needs.
Well, but, Senator,
I understand we've gone down this road. You're telling me they made this commitment. We were not asked about that commitment in the legislature. We're just here to sign the checks.
But let me tell you, Senator, why I'm at least comfortable, and I think my colleagues are, with where we're starting and why, and I understand that you may have a different view. It's okay, but I would appreciate the chance to express this.
Absolutely.
Which is that the Bakersfield to Palmdale area is largely undeveloped as we come into the Antelope Valley. The Antelope Valley is growing, but we have a couple different routes that we're looking at. In fact, tomorrow at our meeting, we're going to be looking at an alternatives analysis of different routes. The Central Valley is growing so fast that if we don't secure right-of-way there, it is just going to become increasingly difficult to ever look at how we connect that. And I want to emphasize this point. Now that we have embraced the blended approach, we know how we're coming into Los Angeles. It's along the Metrolink corridor, at least from Sylmar to LA Union Station and down to Anaheim. We know how we're coming into San Francisco. It's along the Caltrain corridor from San Jose to San Francisco. We don't have right-of-way now in the Central Valley. We do see tremendous growth there. I was in Bakersfield recently for meetings with the city council and folks there. I was staying at a hotel across from the train station. Our alignment is going to go through there. I was looking up, and there were new buildings on either side of the train station, and I said to our engineers, please don't tell me that our alignment is going to go through one of those. I said, oh, yep, that apartment building over there. They said it was so frustrating as we were coming down and laying out the route, we saw the framing going up for this building, and now this is a new building that if we build high-speed rail, we would have to acquire and take. And so the issue is that right-of-way, securing the right-of-way is critically important. And I think that by looking at the Merced to Bakersfield area, we can get a spine of the system built, and we are poised then, and I don't think we're that far away fiscally from completing a financing package that can get us across even before we look to you for access to cap and trade dollars. So we want to close that gap, but I do think getting a running start where we are is going to work, Senator. I really do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're back. Come back. Senator Lowenthal, you have a committee to chair.
Thank you, Senator.
And as Senator Lowenthal leaves, Senator Lowenthal, you will let us know when it's time for me to come vote in that committee, please. Thank you. All right.
Vote aye.
Do we get to ask you that also?
Mr. Richard, on this issue of following up on the linkage question, I'm going to use the term the authority quite purposefully. In days gone by, we've had a little struggle getting documents on a timely basis from the authority that would help the Legislative Analyst's Office. You remember when we were here on the December 5th, we had some conversation about that struggle. If we're going to ask them to take a look at this and report back to the legislature, I just want to say on the record and in a public forum, then that means we're going to need to have some timely response from the authority in terms of getting us the information we need to make that assessment. And at the risk of being a little bit flip, and since I know you want this process to move along as quickly and expeditiously as it possibly can, I know you'll want to be part of helping to make sure that that's possible. So.
And you know I want a fulsome process here.
That's right. Well. Exactly. So that I'm going to take it back then to where we left off, which was, so the first, I'm going to keep using the 3.5 plus 2.7 model, is $6.2 billion. And I want to thank Senator Saulnier for joining us, the chair of the Transportation and Housing Committee. There you go. So $6.2 billion. Out of $13.5 billion total, if you include the connectivity funds as part of the $10 billion bond package, plus the 3.5 from the feds. We're going to get to the LAO eventually and hear from them, but they've raised a concern that has been raised by others, which is the fact that after that 13.5 is gone, it's not altogether clear whether any additional funds would be available or where they might come from. So my question to you is, if that's the only money you ever get, or if it's the only money you ever get for the foreseeable future, by which I'll say the next decade, if you spent every penny of it, what would we have at the end of that $13.5 billion expenditure? Because this goes to the conversation we've been having, and I think we're having the right conversation, which is in an era of uncertainty, it is even more important than it would be under some other set of circumstances to know what do you get for your 13.5 in the way of, you call it independent utility, I call you standalone value, the Brits might call it value for money, whatever we want to call it. And I'm going to give you what may seem an odd analogy, which is if I had $200,000 to build a house and I knew I had the $200,000, I'd start with the foundation, and I'd put in some infrastructure, because that's what you build your house on. If, on the other hand, I only had 20% of that, which coincidentally $13.5 billion is about 20% of the $68.5 billion price tag. If I only had 20%, I might say, well, you know what? Instead of building a foundation, like putting in the pipes and then having nothing I can live in, I might take the 20%, the $40,000 that I had, if that's all I had, and build myself a nice, cozy little house and hope that I could add on to it over the coming years. It would be a very different way I would approach this. I'd want a house that gave me independent utility or value added after I spent my 20%. So if you spend another, what is that, $7.3 billion, how far does that get you, and what do you have at the end of that?
The problem, Mr. Chairman, is, of course, because the bond money needs to be matched, we would have to leave that I started to say the Treasury. It's not technically that. But we really couldn't come to you to ask you to access that unless we could bring you some match with that.
So absent that match, what we're going to end up with is $6.2 billion spent on 130 miles of what still is conventional rail, not high-speed rail, no causative train control, no electrification, no high-speed rolling stock in a low ridership area, and some money sitting in unused bonding authority. Is that where we end up absent a match?
Not quite, Mr. Chairman. The budget request you have in front of you today includes additional funding for the connectivity dollars, and we would also anticipate sometime in the near future that we would spend additional dollars to effectuate the memoranda of understanding that we talked about. The precise amount of that it draws on the bond money is a little unclear because
I'm sorry, before we get to the bookends, I just want to stay on the expenditure of the $6.2 billion.
So what I would say to you is that if somebody said to us, okay, that's it, the door has closed, this is where you are for right now, and if you'll allow me, sir, I would like to reserve that we do believe that we will have access to the cap and trade funds as a legally constituted amount. But I understand your question was other than that. I didn't want to waive my position on that. I would go to my colleagues and we would look at this. I think the first thing that we would do would be to go back to where we were before, which is to say there's an additional increment that we believe that we're close to closing on, probably close to $1 billion to electrify and put PTC, positive train control, on that segment. See if we could work with developers, train up suppliers to demonstrate high-speed rail and all those other things. What we would have then would be a track that would allow us to get further knowledge about, if not operations, revenue operations of high-speed rail, at least the operations allow us to think about how to do system integration work and so forth. And at the same time, we would have improved the rail network throughout Central California. We would have reduced travel times, we would have taken cars off the road, and we would have independent utility. Now, my friends at the LAO will say to you, well, that's not worth $6 billion. And perhaps that's true. The legal standard, which may be different from the policy standard that you, in your prerogative, can look at, requires that it have independent utility. It doesn't require that it exactly equal what the expenditure was, because we'd be making an investment for the future. But that's what we would have.
But, Mr. Richard, we're, in some respects, understanding that you have, and I want to acknowledge this, you heard what got said in December, you heard what got said in other venues, you have attempted to now provide what I'll call additional value added in higher ridership areas, and I think bring it sooner, better, cheaper to those areas. But if we don't have any additional funding forthcoming, and I understand you think cap and trade may be the answer, if we don't have more money from the feds or another bond measure or private sector development, private sector investment, which is not yet committed, at the end of $6.2 billion, we've got 130 miles of conventional rail in a low ridership area. And when we were here in December, the answer was that gives us 45 minutes off the commute time, which, if I remember, the legislative analyst's office put a $15 million price value on that shaving of commute time. Do you remember your work in that area?
I thought it was $1 billion. I mean, that's what I thought it was.
Brian Weatherford with the LAO, and we provided some information to you on a confidential basis that showed that...
Not anymore, it didn't.
Not anymore, it didn't. So we did our own analysis, and for some, depending on who was riding the train, some people would see benefits in terms of time savings of actually in excess of 45 minutes, we believe. The total would be about $15 million a year.
Which is not a great return on investment for $6.2 billion. We can have that conversation some other time, perhaps. But my point is, absent this additional investment, we are still left with what some would characterize as a stranded asset of modest value. And that's why we're continuing to have this conversation.
Well, may I just... Mr. Chairman, I can't dispute that characterization, but I can also offer that there is an alternative characterization of it. And I guess I would start by saying that there has been great enthusiasm on the part of the rail operators in the Central Valley for this opportunity to make these investments in that rail system, number one. Number two, I believe that this also provides significant benefits that go beyond just the issue of passenger rail, because, not to get too lyrical about it, but the movement of freight in and out of the valley over that pass into our ports, which have 44% of America's imports and which face an existential threat from the Panama Canal expansion, is very critical. And we've been talking with the freight railroads, because if we can make that move, it also increases capacity, speed, and safety of freight operations. That is a value. And we would be strengthening systems that connect Bakersfield to the Bay Area. That would also include the ACE train, which connects into BART prospectively in San Jose. We would also, it unlocks the ability for us to make the urban bookend investments, because they then become part and parcel of a future high-speed rail system.
If and when additional funding, which is not yet secured, is forthcoming.
I'm sorry, I want to make sure I understood.
A future high-speed rail system only if and when additional high-speed rail funding is forthcoming.
That is
source to be identified.
Yes, but it is not contingent on that for us to make those investments now. The only requirement for us to make those investments now is that they be part and parcel of something that is usable for a future high-speed rail system, irrespective of how quickly it would come. This is critical to the Caltrain electrification. We can't do that as a stand-alone investment. If we were sitting here today and we had no investment in the Central Valley, I don't believe we would have the legal authority to spend Prop 1A money on a Caltrain investment.
And let me just say, I personally don't find it a very compelling argument if your case is that members of the Senate should understand that they don't get to make sensible investments in high ridership areas unless they spend $6.2 billion on a conventional rail system of 130 miles in a low ridership area.
Senator, we're both members of the bar. I'm just telling you how I would look at the legal issues that would constrain it.
I agree with your legal understanding, and I want to be very clear. Whenever I've talked about the blended system, I have talked about the blended system in the context of a larger high-speed rail enterprise for the state of California.
Yes.
I do not believe that it would be either legal or appropriate to take high-speed rail bond money that the taxpayers voted for high-speed rail and invest it purely for commuter purposes.
Yes,
I think
sir,
we can agree on that.
We do.
But my point is, saying that the only way you get to sprinkle a little dough in the north and south is if you go off and spend $6.2 billion on a conventional rail track in a low ridership area may not be the most persuasive argument we've got in terms of what's before us. I want to go to Senator Fuller if she's got questions, and then I want to go to the Legislative Analyst's Office because they have put something before us. We're going to be here a while. So, Senator.
Well, I join all my colleagues in their quest to make sure that this is a feasible project that has long-lasting benefits for all of California, because I've received your point well today that if we are going to have high-speed rail, it has to have a spine, and that spine has to be in the Central Valley. And I appreciate the progress that you've made since last time we saw, not you, but they, in revisiting some of the issues that made the Central Valley route very problematic, that that many of the Central Valley residents, not all, saw as problematic. So I appreciate some of the route changes and some of the outreach that has improved somewhat the attitude in the Central Valley. I think we have a joint sort of mission here today to find a way that that we can all have a rail system, high-speed rail in this case, that we're proud of and that is sustainable in future years. But I have to say that even though, you have put forward the hypothesis that the cap-and-trade money can be legally used in this way, I think we're going to need some evidence of that. I'm looking forward to the evidence from council about the questions that we've asked you, because part of our problem has been the back and forth between the legislature and the authority and the peer review and the LEO, and then what's been happening on the actual ground. So for me today, I really appreciate that you are bringing forth details that help us begin to kind of glue all those pieces together. But I do think it's going to take some time, as our chair has indicated, to get some evidence and some answers that the pieces that we're trying to glue together have more than just hopes, but have some solid evidence that we can proceed, and it won't be risky investment ground, because this is basically quite an investment. So from my point of view, I'm very appreciative that we are trying to do a plan that provides a spine that works. But I'm also appreciative of the fact that it has to eventually, or at some point, be a profitable plan. And we just haven't had a lot of faith or trust, depending on how you look at it from whose point of view, that the last authority that testified in front of us could get us there. And so now you still have some more pieces to that authority, but I really do want to say today that I really appreciate you taking the leadership to be here with us today and help us get to the next place. Ultimately, I'm still not there yet about some of the LAO's concerns. I have read them, and I'm very in agreement, very much in agreement that some of those concerns need to be met. And I think we've brought the total down some, or a lot, but I don't think that we've brought the total down to the expectation that was initially given to the voters at the ballot box. So I guess what I'm trying to do is to let you know that I'm very appreciative of why you think this is the best place to put the spine, and all of the things that you're going to bring out today, and I hope you continue to do that until you get them all on the table for us. But that ultimately what I'm looking for is strong evidence that there is a plan that we can go forward that isn't, that all the pieces are out there sort of floating around and we'll just get there and the money will show up. My perspective is I don't even see where that we're going to get federal money. So I'm maybe even on the farther end of the feasibility scale than maybe even the chair.
Senator DeSaulnier, would you like to raise comments or ask questions before we go, and then we'll go to the LAO?
No, I just want to thank you, and I'm a visitor on this committee, and I appreciate Senator Simitian and Senator Fuller and Senator Lowenthal asking me to participate. I do want to say I know that Dan, that all of you have put in yeoman's work trying to fix what was a very difficult situation. However, I was just sitting here thinking this is a Jerry Maguire moment. I feel like as those of us who've been supportive of high-speed rail, it's always been help me, help you. But we're at the point where show me the money. I mean, and it just doesn't, it's a hard reach even for those of us who believe in the vision that, especially, and I'll just speak for me and the budget subcommittee that I spend all my time in lately, where we're expected to cut $2 billion to Health and Human Services on top of cutting $4.2 billion that the governor recommended last year. This is, just the general fund responsibility for what you're asking us to do is not is not de minimis. So happy to listen. I still have an open mind, but I'm a long way from yes on the funding. At least I'm not on the committee, but as it comes to me, I've got probably more questions to be answered than less.
Okay. Thank you. Why don't we go to the LAO at this point? As I understand it, the LAO has had a chance to review the plan as approved by the High-Speed Rail Authority on the 12th. We have I think about a 10-page written report, something like that, which I've had a chance to read carefully. But why don't you go ahead and share with us whatever your observations are that you think, including your recommendation, obviously.
Okay.
And then I'm guessing that will prompt some questions. I have my copy. If other members need a copy, I know we have copies here. And if you'd introduce yourselves, plural, for the committee, that would be helpful, and for members of the public.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Brian Weatherford with the Legislative Analyst's Office, and I do have with me today Tiffany Roberts, my colleague who's an expert on cap and trade issues, and Farah Brocht. And we have indeed reviewed the business plan and the governor's budget proposals. And I'm not, we did prepare a 10 or 12 page brief and provided that to you, and as well as on the LAO's website. And I'm not going to run through all of that today. It is a little lengthy, and I will try to keep my remarks relatively brief. Our primary concern with the business plan is, as was raised in the committee today, the funding gap between what we have and what we're going to need to even to initiate revenue service on an initial operating section. And so that does remain our primary concern. One thing that I would add that I'm not sure we discussed fully in our brief was, but in partial response to what we heard from the High-Speed Rail Authority, is that in defense of, in discussing other types of transportation programs, such as highway programs and urban transit programs, while those programs do not necessarily have all the funding required for all the projects and those programs identified at any given time, they do have a dedicated stream of funding over time that's usually sufficient to cover the cost of any of one of those projects, and certainly many of those projects over time. And that stream of funding is dedicated. And we don't have anything like that. We have a federal program, but it relies on annual appropriations, and it doesn't have any routine dedicated federal funding for it. And there's also no dedicated stream of funding from state sources either, obviously. We only have the Proposition 1A. So that's, in our eyes, the primary difference between the federal highway program and the urban transit programs and the local self-help counties, for instance. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Tiffany Roberts, because we do have some very serious concerns about the concept of using cap and trade revenues as backstop.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tiffany Roberts, Legislative Analyst's Office. So next week in this committee on the resources side, we're going to be covering a great deal of information on cap and trade. And I don't want to spend too much time on the background of cap and trade and legal constraints associated with that revenue. However, I do think it's important that we point out that based on an opinion that we've received from Legislative Counsel, we've noted that cap and trade revenues constitute mitigation fees, and as such, in order for their use to be valid as mitigation fees, cap and trade revenues must be used to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. We noted in our write-up on high-speed rail that the administration's proposal to possibly use cap and trade revenues for the construction of high-speed rail raises three primary concerns. Two of these concerns stem from legal constraints, and the third concern, I think, is probably from a cap and trade perspective the most important concern, and it relates to the policy of choosing greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies. So first, using cap and trade revenues for the construction of high-speed rail would not help achieve the primary goal of AB 32. And as you all know, the primary goal of that law is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. The timing of completion of this project is such that it won't even be operational before 2020. And because of this timing issue, there could be legal risk in using cap-and-trade revenues for this infrastructure project. We would continue to recommend that the legislature seek Ledge Council's opinion when considering legal risk. The second issue we've raised is that high-speed rail would be a net emitter of greenhouse gas emissions for many years. When we received the business plan for the high-speed rail, we asked the authority about an analysis on the impact that this project would have in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, they gave us some numbers in an email, but these are old numbers, and they're associated with outdated assumptions and outdated variables. The analysis is outdated, and therefore it's not germane to today's conversation or this business plan. We've reviewed an independent study that has done rigorous analysis and found that if the project meets its ridership targets and renewable electricity commitments, construction and operation of the system would potentially emit more greenhouse gas emissions than it would reduce for approximately the first 30 years that the system is in operation. I also want to point out that earlier today in the Assembly, the authority testified that it has analysis that shows that there would be a greenhouse gas emission benefit of this business plan. But when I asked them for that analysis after the hearing, they said they had not yet completed that analysis. They also testified that the electrification of Caltrain will help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We do need to recognize that while some electricity could come from renewable sources, a majority of the electricity will likely be produced in traditional power plants, and as we're all well aware, there are greenhouse gas emissions associated with traditional sources of electricity. Without an analysis that shows what sources will supply the electricity, it's unsubstantiated that any electrification of the system would have a net GHG benefit. If this project is a net emitter of emissions for many years, that raises legal risk. And we're not clear, how then the authority could state that cap-and-trade revenues would be legally constituted, especially if they haven't done the analysis. The third issue we've raised... Yes, I am. Thank you.
Keep going, Ms.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think probably what's most important to this conversation when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions in the cap-and-trade program is that when you're thinking about how to allocate cap-and-trade auction revenues, you want to be thinking about the return on your investment for those dollars. And the analysis that we've seen relative to the RPS, relative to green building standards, relative to energy efficiency, with programs like that, you're actually getting a much better return on your investment than spending billions of dollars on a high-speed rail system. So I'll conclude my remarks there. I'm happy to take questions, or I'm happy to turn it back over to Mr. Weatherford.
All right, let's stay on this issue. There's more in the analysis from the Legislative Analyst's Office that I want to come back to. But let's stay on cap-and-trade for a minute since we're dug in so deep. Mr. Richard, here's my three-word summary of what I've heard about cap-and-trade from the administration. Intriguing but speculative. That's it in a nutshell. We are very early on in these conversations. And so I would call it intriguing but speculative. I'm going to ask a few leading questions so you understand where I'm headed. Okay. The Department of Finance, how much money has the state of California received from cap-and-trade so far?
To date, Karen Finn with the Department of Finance. To date, the program hasn't started yet. The auction process starts in approximately November of this year.
All right, so that would be zero to date then, is that correct?
Zero to date.
Okay, zero to
correct.
date. Then, going forward, in order for cap-and-trade funds to be used for the purpose of funding high-speed rail, the legislature would have to make that determination as part of its annual budget process. Is that
Absolutely.
correct?
That is
Okay.
correct.
So that's a determination that has never been made by the legislature previously and will be a subject of some debate and discussion, I gather, going forward. Then we get to the question, Ms. Roberts, that you have, which I think you're encouraging us to talk to our legislative council about. That may be another letter for Senator Saulnier and I to send off to the Leg Council that says there are questions here about, given the fact that our greenhouse gas targets, as I recall, are 2020, and we're not talking about completing the initial operating segment until 2021, if I remember correctly, that this may or may not be an appropriate use for cap-and-trade funds if we're supposed to be using those funds for our greenhouse gas accomplishments. Am I still on track with your thinking? Okay. And then that's entirely apart from the larger policy question, that legal question, as to whether or not this would be the best way to spend those funds. And we're back to the earlier conversation we had about making a priori assumptions about how these dollars ought to be spent. It may be that even if one member or the other of this committee is unenthusiastic about cap-and-trade, their view is, well, if there's going to be cap-and-trade revenue, shouldn't we be spending it on something else? A debate which we can't very well have after the fact if the assumption going forward is we can move forward on high-speed rail this year relying on cap-and-trade when we've never had the legislative debate about is that how we would spend cap-and-trade funds if and when they ever arrived and if and when they were determined to be legal. I think we're looking at a hit to the general fund of roughly $700 million a year if and when we expend all $10 billion of the bonds and have to do the debt service. Department of Finance, am I in the ballpark?
That's about right.
Thank you. So that's already, in a budget, as you heard from Senator Saulnier, those are already going to be very painful cuts given our general fund situation. The administration, Department of Finance, as I recall, the proposed budget has talked about ways in which these cap-and-trade funds might be used lawfully, appropriately, to address greenhouse gas mitigations, but also in ways that mitigate the hit on the general fund. Am I remembering that correctly?
In this budget, you're correct.
That's right. By definition, if you go off and spend them on a new program, high-speed rail, however worthy that new program may be, you cannot use them for general fund mitigation. So the opportunity cost of expending those dollars is significant. Having tossed around a series of very leading questions, Mr. Richard, I'm now going to give you the opportunity to share your thoughts with us about the issue of the not yet received, in my view speculative, not yet determined to be legally appropriate, opportunity cost cap-and-trade dollars that are your backstop for the program.
Mr. Chairman, I know this is going to shock you, but I actually welcome this opportunity to respond.
No, and Mr. Richard, that's in all seriousness. That's what I appreciate about the opportunity for this conversation.
No, I do. And Senator, a couple of things on redirect here for your questions. I'll try to be very brief, but we'll be happy to supplement our answers and so forth. But let me offer three different thoughts here. First of all, there is no question that if we expend the entire amount of bond funds at some point, that the dollars you're talking about for the general fund impact are there. But, I guess I would request respectfully that on the one hand you limited us to talking about the dollars that are in front of you today for the facility in front of you today, and that facility, that appropriation request that you have before you today does not depend on any cap-and-trade dollars and is a substantially lower impact on the general fund, although I will say with great haste and empathy, I wouldn't want to be sitting where you're sitting having to make these decisions. My hope is that if we do put these dollars to work, we take people off of leaning on the safety net, we put some dollars into the funds, but I understand the nature of the kind of decisions you have to make. And I do not in any way make light of those. Secondly, I'm going to make the assertion that the cap-and-trade dollars as a dedicated revenue source, should the legislature choose to agree that we can tap that, is at this moment at least as stable as any other federal revenue source out there. And let me be very specific about this.
You may be damning them with faint praise.
Well, I understand. But we're being told, and this goes to the heart of the issue that Mr. Kempton has raised. Because every time I have come before one of these proceedings and said, you know, from my experience in transit, Senator Saulnier's experience as a person who's served in leadership positions in the region, you know, we've never had all the dollars. The response from Mr. Weatherford is very similar to the response from Mr. Kempton, which has been, yes, but those projects have at least had a window they could go to that allowed them to go. Well, let's talk about those windows today. The majority party in the House of Representatives has proposed slamming the 30-year door shut on mass transit access to the Highway Trust Fund. So all of our mass transit projects in California, if that position prevails, would not have any access to any federal highway trust fund-based projects at all. That means the new source funds, out the window. All of those would be gone. Even if that does not turn out to be the case, the Congress has been wrestling with this. They are on their 13th extension of the Surface Transportation Act, this time for 90 days, because they couldn't even come together to agree on a 2-year extension. So, what we have in front of us, should the legislature agree that this is there, would be at least as stable as those funding sources, and I don't mean to be glib in saying that. Secondly, the leadership on the environmental side, the environmental policy side in the administration, was consulted by the Director of Finance before this issue was brought to the fore. And their view has been, number one, that they absolutely believe that high-speed rail is appropriate for these dollars, both legally and as a matter of policy. And we do have environmental documents out there right now that show a certain level of greenhouse gas reductions. And secondly, beyond that, Mary Nichols made a statement yesterday in response to the LAO's public release of their document, defending the use of cap and trade for high-speed rail purposes. It was in the scoping plan for AB 32. High-speed rail was specifically identified in the scoping plan for AB 32. Mr. Chairman, I have great faith, by the way, in your RPS bill as changing the mix of electric power. That
Shameless plug, but stay at it, Mr. Richard.
I'm going to do cell phone hands-free next, Mr. Chairman.
Fit it in there.
But we have every confidence that, and it's not just taking the cars off the road. It's what we can be doing to accomplish the objectives of AB 375 and transit land use around these stations, which we're very committed to and starting to work on. And what Secretary Nichols said to us was that we're missing the big picture here. High-speed rail, if it's done right, will be transformative in terms of how we move around the state. It will have a major impact on greenhouse gas emissions for the state's economy. Let me also say, with all due respect to Ms. Roberts, that we do not believe that it is the proper analysis when they talk about net emitter. I would respectfully suggest that that is not only not correct in terms of the way that greenhouse gas emissions are credited, but I think you as legislators should hope it's not correct. Because if they're right, every refinery in Senator DeSaulnier's district who seeks to go out and make an investment in facilities to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions would immediately be charged for the construction emissions associated with that. That is not the way I understand the greenhouse gas program and cap and trade program works. And besides, we already have to mitigate those as part of our CEQA process for building high-speed rail. With all due respect, I think the legislative analyst is just wrong on this position, and I believe that they're incorrect on the applicability not only of the cap and trade program, but of the specific applicability of it to this as a legal matter and as a policy matter.
And you're helping me make the case for why it's going to be so important that we have adequate time to tease out these issues in the weeks and months ahead, Mr. Richard.
Mr. Chairman, I kind of knew you were going to say that. So that's, which is fine. But I also want to say in response that we've thought about a lot of these things, and while you have to ask these questions, I believe we come to you prepared to try to deal with these. People will differ, Mr. Chairman, but these are the right questions. We will do whatever we can to help the committee look at these issues.
Thank you. Ms. Richard, I'm going to try and sort of move us along a little bit. I'm going to come back to Senator Fuller and to Saulnier in just a moment. But to go back to the LAO and to try and pull a couple of, as I like to say, topic sentences out of the report. There's a clear topic sentence on the first page in the summary, which is, we recommend the legislature not approve the governor's various budget proposals to provide additional funding for the project. That is your conclusion, is it not?
That's our primary recommendation.
And there were really, as I read it, two principal concerns articulated that got you to that place. That the business plan and the budget proposals raised concern about the speculative nature of future funding. That was front and center. And the second point was, reading the headline on page 9, that there were significant changes made recently without necessary details. And so your advice to us not to proceed was a function of, primarily, concern about the speculative nature of future funding and the lack of detail with respect to the recently made significant changes in the plan. Is that fair?
That's correct. Given the number of changes recently together with the funding, we recommend not moving forward with committing $5.9 billion in Central Valley at this time.
And then as a plan B, because everybody wants one, you've said if the legislature should decide to move forward with funding, that you had, I count, at least 4 proposals or suggestions. And the first, and I'm looking at page 10 now, is that you suggest providing funding at this time for only those contracts that will be awarded in 2012-13, and that you believe it would be important to improve the governance of the project, and that there needed to be budget bill language dealing with vacancies and staffing issues at the High-Speed Rail Authority, and that certain critical information and key documents be made available if we're going to proceed with funding so that the decision is a well-informed one. Is that a fair summary?
Excellent summary, yes.
All right, thank you. Then what I'd like to do is go to the public for comment after we hear if there are questions or comments from Senator Fuller, and then to Saulnier. I have a couple of observations I want to share with the authority, with my colleagues, and with the public before we go to the public, so I hope you'll all bear with that. Senator Fuller, it's yours.
Well, I'm going to digress just a little bit, but this is still where the money is and question. And for me, the private capital is a very important piece. And looking at your summary, it looks like the private capital is mostly in the inns or, according to this, San Jose to San Fernando Valley or San Francisco to Anaheim. And so I'm assuming that that there is a better market to get money for private capital in those areas. And so how might is that true, and what are your plans to get that capital? And maybe that will shed some light on some other way to proceed.
Thank you, Senator. Very quickly, first of all, I would say it's not true in one sense, which is that we see a very strong role for private capital here, and we depend on that. Our business model is that there would be an initial investment of public dollars, but the private sector would come in, operate the trains on the system, do the operation and maintenance, and help us build out the system. In order to do that, they have to be confident that there will be revenues that they could make as a profit. When we're looking at these regional systems, even my old BART system, it was very efficient, but it didn't generate a profit, although Senator Saulnier, our BART to SFO line, seemed to do that this year. But I know. Thank you, sir. But it got there. But, Senator, we believe that the private sector will be interested in that, and that's where connecting the state creates a different type of market for them, because now they're competing against airlines and so forth. My colleague, Mr. Rossi, who was the former vice chairman of Bank of America, has spent many, many years in the finance area, and Mr. Chairman, if you'd like, I know he can supplement this answer or we can deal with it directly, but Mr. Rossi spent a great deal of time looking at the conditions under which private sector participation would be triggered and what kind of dollars we can expect. And the basic model here, Senator, is that we would be, as we build this, we would essentially sell the right to the private sector to come in, put up the trains, collect the revenues, operate and maintain the system to our standards. We would sell that right. They would write a check to the taxpayers of California, which could either be used to build out further parts of the system, or in some parts of the world, those checks are used to pay back some of the initial capital. And so we have done a lot of work on this. Mr. Rossi is a tremendous resource for the High-Speed Rail Authority because of his deep background in this area.
Well, Mr. Richard has laid it out pretty well, Senator. It is not about the bookends or the more urbanized areas. It is about the ability to get a stable revenue source, which happens in, as we look at it from our perspective in the plan in 2023. You start 2022, 2023. At that point, we believe that we can, in fact, sell future revenues at a discount anywhere from 8, 11, 14%, showing about $10.1 billion there. And that has to do with the finalization of the iOS and the operation thereof. So it's not really about, as you characterize it, the bookends or the urban areas. It's about having an operating segment that generates sufficient ridership such that you can sell those future revenues. And when you look at the plan as you have, what happens at that stage is you're looking at an approximate, on a cash flow basis, a net operating cash flow, or net operating cash flow margin, if you would, of approximately 48%, which in turn allows someone from the private sector to be able to, in fact, calculate exactly what that's worth to them, predicated on two things. One, on a discount rate, which is how they will ultimately make the decision in pricing, but predicated on how much not only is that worth, but what they in turn can run it more efficiently for to even make more money.
So then, in order to, if you were to try to probe the market a bit and try to find out who might be interested in those options, you would have to be how much further along, or what would you have to do?
Are you asking, Senator, could we get it sooner?
Initially I was thinking that if it was an investment opportunity on like two ends, and then you might be able to go out sooner and find out how you could raise some private money or have private partnerships. In this case, since it's predicated on 2023, then what I guess what I'm trying to ask is, what would the soonest that you could find out or probe investor interest in a reliable way?
Well, the issue is reliable, right? Because everyone today who assumes that this investment will be made has an interest. Now, since 2004, if my memory suits me, there have been 16 such investments made in the private sector, ranging from several billion to $14 billion. There's no doubt there is a market. I mean, if you can sell future revenues of an Elton John concert, you can sell future revenues of a railroad line. The fact is that there is an interest once there is a clearer understanding on behalf of the investor that you have, in fact, a stabilized ridership that will generate, in fact, the kind of margin I just said our plan projects.
So stabilizing ridership probably couldn't happen until...
Well, as we said, we plan for it in 2023.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Let me just ask a question. One of the concerns about about this is that as the LAO and the peer review group have both suggested, it seems to me that the risk is on the taxpayers of California to spend $13.5 billion, and if it's a failure, we're stuck with the loss, and if it's a success, we're handing our success that we paid for off to somebody else. As a business proposition, that doesn't sound very appealing, frankly. It sounds like the risk is on us and the upside is on somebody else. Now, what I thought I heard you say earlier is that in some models, the hope would be that there'd be the ability to have a successful enough project that we could actually recoup some of our initial investment, and or that if we had a successful enough model, we would be able to then generate private investment for the remainder so that the taxpayer wouldn't be on the hook. Am I understanding your model correctly?
I would refer you to the plan, Senator. We have run in this plan 60-year cash flows in order to take the cash flows out a particular time frame, since these are 100-year assets. And to address your question specifically, the state can make up its mind which way it would like to go. If we hit our numbers, and on the full phase one, blended, not full phase one, but I'm sorry, the full blended phase, we would, in 43 years from the beginning of construction, we would receive in free cash flow $68 billion. We would, in fact, repay these monies. Now, we can have a discussion about what the actual indexing values of those dollars are. I'm sure my friends at the LAO would want to see that study, but we can do that. But the cash flows are there. The question then becomes how you utilize those cash flows. In 12 of the 13 operations around the world, and I don't want to talk about the 13th one because that's China, and I'm not going to try and pretend I understand their numbers. But if you look at the other 12, what appears to be the case is that they generate enough money on a net operating cash basis to pay upwards of 13 to 25%, that's a little high, I'm sorry, 13 to 20% of future construction. So we could do that, or we could do, as we have in the plan, we could sell the future revenues at what we think is a reasonable discount in order that we can use those monies to reinvest in the next segment. It's a matter, I think, Senator, of how you decide at that time how you would like to utilize those funds.
All of this being predicated on the eventual rightness of the revenue and ridership projections.
Yes, or let me put it to you another way. It would depend on whether or not all of the sensitivity analysis we have done to take those bands and move them closer and closer together and then haircut them to the point that if you take a look at 2026 and you take a 35% increase in expenses and you reduce revenues by 35%, which is at my last count, and I'm pretty old, but I think that's a 70% swing, we are still $312 million above break even. I think it would be very hard. We can talk about this model forever, but if you want to take a look at the sensitivities and the way we would make an investment, you can't find another major project where ridership has been off that much. And it really isn't ridership. It's really a matter of whether the ridership and the revenues they're therefore generated and the expenses as they are managed that give you that number.
All right. Senator Solney, anything on this point? Folks, we're going to go to the public in a moment. This is the beginning of a longer conversation. The analysis from the committee staff today had some suggested questions and issues for discussion dealing with funding, reasonableness of estimates, benefit and cost, independent utility of early phases, blended operation and compliance with Prop 1A, private sector participation, cap and trade revenue, California Environmental Quality Act issues, and those are going to be serious, and we've gotten what I would characterize as mixed messages there. There are some management questions, which I want to ask about today. As a district representative, I've got questions about where we stand on commitments that either have or haven't been made on the peninsula with respect to the blended system. There are questions about the opportunity costs, which I referenced in passing earlier. There's the ongoing conversation in the legislature about whether this should be put back out to a vote of the public. There are the linkage issues that the senator mentioned earlier. There are questions about outreach and engagement, not just short-term and in specific places, but has the authority turned a corner in terms of the way it works with the public? Because if you're going to go forward and actually start pushing dirt around to the tune of $6.2 billion, boy, does it need to get better than it has been in the recent past. Yes, that's just some of them. And so here's the statement I want to make. I have been frustrated for 3.5 years at the tone of this conversation around the state. We have a very hard set of choices to make in the next few months. I'm hoping that the tone gets better, not worse. I'm hoping that people are respectful of one another's legitimate points of view and the questions and concerns they raise. I'm hoping that's the case both in this building as part of our process and out there in the wider community. That has not always been the case in my observation over the last 3.5 years. There are folks who are absolutely determined advocates for the project. Fair enough. There are folks who are who absolutely determined that this is the biggest boondoggle they've ever seen, and there isn't an answer you can give that will satisfy them. But here's the role that we have to play as members of a legislative body, and I want to be very clear about this. Our job is oversight, not cheerleading. And when we do our job, I think people need to respond with that understanding. Just as when the authority engages with the public, it needs to understand that legitimate concerns and questions about local impacts on cities, neighborhoods, homes, and businesses should not be dismissed as simple NIMBYism. They need to be responded to thoughtfully and respectfully. When people in the community raise questions about ridership, financing, these are all legitimate concerns from people who want to know that if we're going to spend $68.5 billion or more, that it is money well spent. Now, there are two textbooks from my political science days, Mr. Richard, that I remember as an undergraduate. One's called The Real Majority. I'll talk to you about that one another time, by Scammon and Wattenberg.
I read it.
The other one is called Victims of Groupthink by Irving L. Janis, which is still on my shelf somewhere. And boy, has there been a lot of groupthink on this project in the last 3.5 years. People have hunkered down in their bunkers, taken the view that anybody who has a different point of view isn't just someone who's raising legitimate questions, but is not just an adversary, but an enemy. That's got to stop if we're going to do the right thing for California in the next few months. I'm going to tell you my personal experience, not to impose it on everybody, but by way of illustration. In 2002, I not only voted as a member of the legislature to put the bond measure on the ballot, I was a co-author of the measure. In 2004, when there was a proposal to delay the measure until 2010, I was one of just 3 members in the Assembly Transportation Committee who voted against that delay. In 2008, when there was a proposal before us which actually went on the ballot, I not only voted for it as a legislator, I was a co-author again. When the measure was on the ballot, I publicly supported it. Notwithstanding the trips, stumbles, and falls of the authority over the last 3.5 years, I have voted for full funding in every one of the 3 years that I've been the chair of the Budget Subcommittee. And when there have been 2 occasions to vote to bring things to a halt by virtue of legislation from Mr. LaMalfa, I have voted against them. For a variety of reasons, some of which responsibility rests with the authority, What was once a 60 to 40% level of support when the measure was on the ballot in my district is now shrunk to about 40% support in my district. And of course, you've seen similar results around the state. Notwithstanding that drop in support in my district, I have for 3 years gone home every year and when asked in town hall said, I continue to support high-speed rail done right. But when we ask you hard questions in this committee, the historic tendency of the authority, and I want to be very clear about that, has been to act as if somehow we were not just exercising our oversight responsibility, that we were not even adversaries, we were enemies by virtue of doing our job. That's got to stop if we're going to get to a successful outcome, whatever a successful outcome may be in the next few months. That has to be a different conversation with every member of the legislature and with every member of the public than we've seen in the past. You are the leader of this revitalized organization, so I'm going to put it on you and ask you to lead your organization in that way. You are our link with the administration, so I'm going to put it on you and ask you to communicate that to the administration as well as through our friends at the Department of Finance. I have worked with Mr. Hartnett for the last 15 years and think he has been a tremendous addition to the board. I know him to be an honest broker, and I think he's brought real value added during his time. He's not as present and visible as you are, but I know of his work, and I think it has been a tremendous contribution. I've worked with you for only 6 months, and in that 6 months, it has been, in my experience, a very good working relationship. But all of this is too important to go sour because people hunker down in their bunkers, characterized those with different points of view as enemies rather than constructive participants in a process that is designed to get us to the right result. As I sit here today, I do not know how I will vote on the funding that you have requested when the time comes. Here's what I do know. I do know that for me, and I can't speak for any other member and wouldn't presume to do so, it will be a very close call. When you're a legislator, some of the decisions we make are very easy, and the ones that are easy for me may be tough for a colleague. The ones that are tough for a colleague may be very easy for me. This is not going to be a judgment that I make where I go home at the end of the day, having cast that vote, and say, I am absolutely sure that that was the right vote. This is going to be a 53-47, one way or the other decision for me. I wish it were clearer, but at this moment, given the history we've had and the circumstances we find ourselves in today, it's going to be a close call for me. But when I make that call as an individual member of the legislature, the thing I want to be able to do when I go home and talk to my folks is tell them that I asked every question that I ought to ask, that I probed until I got the answers that not only we as the legislature, but they as the public were entitled to, and that I made the judgment with all of that in mind, and it was the best judgment I could exercise. So I want to just ask you to move forward and work with us as you have done in the last 6 months with that in mind. And I want to ask the members of the public to keep that in mind as they come forward to testify. This is too important to simply line up on one side or the other of the battle lines and not try and have an intellectually honest and respectful conversation. I hope I haven't filibustered you all into somnolence at this point. Let's see how many good and hearty souls we still have who want to testify.